Well, I am really excited for this summer because we're going to try something I hope that's kind of fun and also a little enlightening, something that will expand your view of the Bible a little bit. But to start out, let me begin with a poll, or not so much a poll, but just ask for some responses. When you were a child, or even today, what were some of your favorite Bible stories? Noah and the Ark. Okay, that's a good one. I remember Noah and the Ark through the Disney cartoon version of it as my first experience of it. And I always was excited that that cartoon would come on because it's a good one. And it's a great story. So, yeah, others. Feeding of the 5,000. Interesting story because there's so many things that happen in it. I'm a foodie, I'm a food guy, and so I like it because of the aspects of that with food. I don't like being hungry, so I can relate to the people in that story. Great story. Yeah? 10 Commandments. And Charlton Heston has to be the one who gives them, right? I mean, because that's what Moses looked like. Yes, that's true. Yeah. Any others? Samson. Oh, boy. I nearly put Samson in here because we don't learn the story of Samson as much anymore. It's one that's kind of falling by the wayside a little bit. And it's worth hearing that story because it is a good one. Yeah.
Moses is maybe fasting.
Oh, yes. Yes, I agree because that is such an amazing story of faith with Moses' mother and his sister. Imagine the heartache of just placing your child in the Nile River with crocodiles and hippos and other things that aren't particularly motherly or nurturing, and everything works out for the best. So yeah, that's a great one. Daniel and the Lion's Den, another great one. Love it. Yeah. Jonah and the Whale. Yes. Not a great fish, but yeah, we know it as Jonah and the Whale. Yeah, last one. Yes, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Shadrach and Benny, who come up in the book of Daniel, and very fascinating story as well. Yeah. Well, these are all great stories, and many of them are ones that I certainly grew up learning and hearing about in Sunday school and reading the Bible with my family at home and things like that. I bet most of you have grown up with those stories as well. Well, this summer we're going to depart from those good familiar stories. We're going to spend some time delving into those lesser-known stories. These ones are a little more obscure. They're kind of stuffed into those books that are way back in the Old Testament. We don't read them very often. Some of them are kind of weird. And I hope that we'll be able to grow through that and also have a little bit of fun along the way. In fact, some of these stories I bet some of you have never heard before. And we're going to do this partly because it's summer and it's, you don't want a deep, heavy sermon series during the summer. You want something that's a little light and engaging. But also we're going to do it because if we're going to say that we're followers of this book and we're followers of the message that we find in this book, then we have a responsibility to learn not just the things that we hear over and over, but also the stories that are incredibly meaningful but that we don't hear every day. Well, how do you present a Bible story that's unfamiliar? I gave that a lot of thought this week. And the first thing I thought about was the first Bible stories that I remember learning, and specifically learning them at the church that we went to when I was in the second grade. It was this little church. It was in a storefront. We basically went there because the son of the pastor was in my class and we were friends. But my parents went to church and they would drop us off in Sunday school. And I remember hearing those stories in Sunday school. But more than the stories, I remember how they were presented. Did anyone here grow up with flannel graph used in Sunday school? Flannel graph was the most ingenious thing that's ever created. This is a flannel graph here. It's printed on flannel. And it usually starts out with a picturesque, kind of pastoral scene in the background. And they have all these characters that you can, and they're made of flannel too, so they stick together. And so you can tell the story as it happens. I assume this is Adam and Eve, is kind of what it looks like to me. Although they're wearing clothes, but that's because it's for children's Sunday school, so they have to wear clothes. Flannel graph was great. And I don't I didn't really understand many of the stories. Most of the time I was looking at it thinking, boy, it would be great if I had a flannel graph at home so I could play, so I could make my own Bible stories. And if Optimus Prime from Transformers made an appearance, or Lion-O from Thundercats, then so be it. But flannel graph was how I learned the first Bible stories, and I see that a lot of you did as well. Well, we have this video because I was trying to think of a way to present this story in a unique way. And this video, what it does is it's sort of a 21st century flannel graph that we will watch now of the story of Eutychus. So let's see that.
And there were a great number of lamps in the upper chamber where we were assembled. And a certain young man named Eutychus, sitting on the window, being oppressed with a deep sleep, as Paul was long preaching, by occasion of his sleep, fell from the third loft down, and was taken up dead. To whom, when Paul had gone down, he laid himself upon him, and embracing him said, "Be not troubled, for his soul is in him." Then, going up and breaking bread and tasting, and having talked a long time to them until daylight, so he departed. And they brought the youth alive, and were not a little comforted. Acts chapter 20, verses 8 through 12.
We'll have some more of those as the weeks unfold. Well, poor Eutychus. It's quite a story. And if you're thinking it's a funny story, well, that's because it was meant to be a funny story. This is meant to be a comedy. I mean, Paul comes to town. This is a big deal. He's well known in early church circles. Even if you live far away, you probably know who Paul is if you're an early Christian. Everyone's excited to hear what he has to say. Apparently, he's drawn a big crowd because the room is packed to the point where people are sitting anywhere where they can find a seat, including a certain third floor windowsill where a young man named Eutychus is listening. So Paul arrives. The Bible says that they break bread and he teaches. We actually don't think this is communion that they're doing. It's more like an early church potluck where they share a meal together. This was common practice in the early church. In fact, among other things, this is probably the first reference to Sunday worship because they meet on Sunday. Never before this in the New Testament do they meet on Sunday. They're still, up until this point, practicing Jews who meet on Friday evening for Sabbath worship. And so the stage is set for Paul, and he begins to preach. And preach. And preach. And well, you start to get the idea. Apparently, he never heard George Burns' advice about a good beginning and a good ending and as little as possible in between, because Paul goes on hour after hour after hour. Like most preachers, he thinks he's got something really interesting to say, and so he keeps on going. After all, sermonettes make Christianettes, as the saying goes. So Paul keeps rambling on until midnight. And he thinks to himself, well, since I'm doing so well, I'll just go a little while longer. Meanwhile, in the congregation, perched perilously in this window, is young Eutychus. Eutychus in Greek means lucky. So lucky, like many people who go to church, is doing his very best to pay attention. But his mind is beginning to wander. It's past midnight. How much longer is this guy just going to keep on droning on like this, he thinks? And the room, it's warm, it's late at night. The story tells us that there are these lamps lit, there's this nice soft glow in the room. He's just had a big meal. Never try to stay awake after Thanksgiving dinner. That's kind of what I see here. So his eyes start to droop. Now this is the part of the story that some of you can identify, I know, because sometimes I see eyes start to droop out there. It's okay. I mean, you know who you are, and yes, I do know who you are. Here I am, week in and week out, doling out my little pearls of wisdom. And I assume that you're just so moved by my profound observations that you close your eyes in deep thought. I'm sure that's what's happening here. And if that's you, that's okay. I've been in your shoes before. In college, I took an astronomy class. I'm a Trekkie, and I like learning about the cosmos, and I needed a science credit. And so I took this class. It was right after lunch. And it was in this room that had just been remodeled. It had these big, comfortable chairs in there and these nice desks. And it was a little bit warm in the room usually because it was, in southern New Mexico, everything's a little bit warm usually. And the professor would show slideshows because it was an astronomy class, all these slideshows of stars and whatnot, which was interesting, but he would turn the lights out to show the stories. And every day I would go to class saying to myself, okay, Josh, this is the day when you're going to stay awake. You're going to do it, you're going to power through it. And I think I probably fell asleep in that class every single day. Pretty soon my head would start to nod every day, and in fact I probably fell asleep every single time. It sneaks up on you. And Eutychus is finding this out. Well, Paul is still droning on, in love with the sound of his own voice, and apparently he's unaware of the bumblebee sort of sound that's emerging from good old lucky Eutychus. And it's lost on Paul that Eutychus' eyes are more or less closed, and his mouth is more or less open, and he's starting to slump over a little bit. Now, I love this story because even the author knows that Paul is being a little too long-winded. In verse 9, Luke tells us that Paul talked on and on. In fact, Paul is so moved by his own words that before you know it, it's too late to stop this young man from tumbling down out of the window. He falls 3 floors, head first. And if a person falls such a distance in such a manner, it's not unreasonable to assume that this is the kind of fall that a person's not just going to limp away from. Paul's preaching has literally bored a person to death. The story says that Eutychus is taken up dead, and in English, it's reasonable to assume that the author, who is Luke, who is a doctor, would have known if he were alive, and Eutychus is not alive. So the crowd rushes downstairs, out of the room. They rush to the boys' side, although the story doesn't exactly make it clear how many of them are rushing to make sure Eutychus is okay, and how many of them are rushing out, hoping to get lost in the commotion and then head home for a good night's sleep. But they're all rushing out for one reason or another. And finally, Paul arrives on the scene, and he quickly takes charge. Now, for all of Paul's foibles in this story, we see here that he is the kind of leader that you want in a crisis. Everyone else is panicking. Paul isn't losing his head. He embraces Eutychus and tells the crowd not to panic. His life has not yet left him. Now, this statement goes back to early Jewish understandings of what happens when you're dead. So the idea went, your soul would sort of hang around your body for 3 or 4 days after death, and then it would leave after that. And so this is a statement of Paul that Eutychus' spirit is still around. Paul is saying his spirit's still about. And in fact, it is, because after some kind of prayer or something that Paul does, Eutychus comes back to life. It's resurrection. Paul, through his faith and through the power of God, rescues and resurrects Eutychus. In fact, this story, a lot of scholars think it's supposed to be a sort of typology, a sort of retelling of the Jesus story. It's meant to remind people of something important in the Christian story. We're all oafish Eutychus types who can fall asleep and do something dumb at any moment. And there's a force that brings us back from the edge. But here's the kicker. This is the part of the story that just, even me, it kind of leaves me scratching my head. Paul brings Eutychus back from death, and after that, you think that he would evaluate the situation and say, okay, maybe enough is enough as far as my sermon is concerned. You think that he would send everyone home for a good night's rest, but not Paul. No, he hasn't gotten around to saying all that he has to say, so he calls everybody back into the room to hear more preaching. He goes on till daylight. This is such a preacher thing to do. Yes, I've gone way too long. Yes, the person died because of that. But I haven't gotten to the climax of my sermon.
He had more material.
He had more material. He got that email a couple weeks ago with the kind of savvy story, and it's going to make a great climax at the end of the sermon, even if you've gotten that email several times yourself. So he goes right on preaching. Goes on until dawn. Paul is a lot of things. But one thing that he's not is the kind of person to take a hint. Probably why Jesus had to strike him blind on the road to Damascus instead of something less unsettling. You know, I had this pastor at one point, really good person. One of my heroes, probably the person, I'm probably in the pulpit because of this person. He inspired me into ministry. This guy is so loving. He's exactly the kind of person that you would want as a pastor. He's the kind of pastor that I hope I can be. And bless his heart, he was the kind of person who could just barely squeeze a 10-minute sermon into 25 minutes or so. Well, my pastor never had anything on Paul. Paul's going to preach until everyone's falling out the window, if that's how long it takes to get the message across. And so he keeps on going. So as we experience this story together, I still am left wondering, what is there to learn from this story? What is there to glean? Does Luke tell us this story to warn pastors against bloviating on ad nauseum? Does he tell us about Eutychus to warn people not to nap in church? I really feel sorry for Eutychus. How would you like to be mentioned in the Bible? People read your story across time, across generations, and the only thing you're known for is as the dude who fell asleep and killed himself at church. Well, maybe there are psychological things to take from this story. For one thing, for all of Paul's tactlessness in the story, you get this glimpse into what a beautiful life of faith he truly did lead. You don't see this when he's preaching, but you do see it when he goes and he rescues Eutychus. Paul's faith in the power of resurrection is pretty darn impressive. Keep in mind, Paul never witnessed Jesus' resurrection. When Jesus was resurrected, Paul was probably a young man. Maybe he was in school learning to be a Pharisee and how to interpret the law and throw stones at people who broke it. Paul hears about the resurrection after the fact, years after the fact. And it's one thing for the other apostles to believe in the resurrection when they saw Jesus walking and talking and as it happened. It's something else entirely to believe in it without seeing it firsthand. Paul never saw a person raised from the dead, and yet he believes. He's willing to place all his eggs in that basket. He's willing to stake everything on the promise that's at the foundation of the gospel, which for all of us who are even further removed from the Jesus story, that's good advice for us as well. There's a good example of us in Paul. He never saw the resurrection, and yet it never crossed his mind that God wouldn't resurrect. And well, lo and behold, look what happens. In the crises that spring up, when we stare death in the face, and when we respond with such unflinching faith. I'm also struck by what's happened here. And I, as a preacher, and all of us as Christians, might want to pay attention. What do you think the Christians in Troas remembered most about that night? Do you think they remembered all of Paul's pithy remarks and his elegant words? Probably not. In fact, even Luke, the author, doesn't seem to think that the sermon was that good. Luke records lots of sermons in Acts. You can read lots of things that Peter preaches and Paul and others. He doesn't record what Paul says in the sermon. Apparently it wasn't the best. I think what the people remember is how Paul's whole being trusts in the power of God. It's not just something that he talks about, but in a crisis, he turns first to God. His actions and his words match. It's easy to say that we're Christians and we're saved. It's easy to smugly state that we believe in the power of God to do anything when we don't have to rely on that power very often. It's easy to say that until something comes up. Someone tumbles out a window. And we're challenged to believe in the power of God to do anything because that's the only chance we have. Too often, that's usually when we panic and start trying to figure out our own solution instead of turning to God. Paul trusts God in all seasons. He trusts God to bring back to life that which is lifeless. For Paul, the resurrection isn't a flowery message meant to make people happy. It's something that can happen and does happen every single day. Is the message of the gospel something that we just talk about, or is it something that we live into actively? I can't tell you how to do that in your own life. The specifics will come together for you in ways that only you will know. But when they do, will people know that you are a Christ follower because you say that you're a Christian, and also because you place your whole trust in God in all things? When I think of long preachers, one of the people that I think of is Wesley, John Wesley. If you ever read some of his sermons, you'll notice that they are a little bit longer than the average sermon would be today. This is partly because, in television culture, we were able to pay attention for about 10 minutes. Our minds are just trained that way, and then we do something else. But Wesley would preach on for 45, 50 minutes, an hour, longer than that, sometimes 2 hours. A few years ago, I got to go to London, and I got to see his pulpit. This is Wesley's pulpit. It was used at a place called the Foundry. It was sort of the base of operations for the early Methodists. Built in an old cannon foundry. That's why it was called the Foundry. Pretty simple little pulpit there. But when you walk around to the other side of it, you'll see that there's that little footrest. So it's not a footrest. It's actually so you can lean down, and your shins are kind of rest against that, because if you're going to preach that long, your feet are going to get tired. This is how preaching, a little window into how preaching and how religion has changed over the centuries. Is this was sort of the standard thing in every pulpit. I haven't seen one in a pulpit since. But see, here's the thing. We talk a lot about Wesley's preaching, but Wesley wasn't known as a great preacher in his time. In fact, the great preacher of the Methodist movement was a man named George Whitefield. Wesley was known as an organizer because he could get people together into groups, and he could challenge those groups in an effective way to grow in holiness, to talk about their lives, to talk about how they encountered God in their lives. And in this way, even though Wesley's sermons were not as well regarded as others in his day, what made his movement captivating was the way that the actions and the words came together in a way that seems true and in a way that seemed compelling to others. What if we lived such a thing? Where we did proudly proclaim that we were Christians. Where we didn't talk about our faith in a way that's heartfelt and in a way that feels real, but it feels real because of the way that those words are lived out in our lives. That's my prayer for you and for me and for all of us as we struggle to live ahead, knowing that we'll fall out a few windows along the way, but that God will carry us through those moments as well.